Hello and welcome again to this series of talks on spiritual gifts from Grace Church Handsworth, and today we're talking about the power gifts, and we're coming to these three gifts of power, which are faith, the workings of miracles, and gifts of healings in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And these are gifts through which God works miraculously through people. And we have made the point that the gifts often overlap and we often can't tell which exactly is working at the same time. Sometimes, in fact, all three of these gifts might be working, as when someone is raised from the dead. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll deal with these three separately. But let's remember, it's not knowing exactly in theory which one they are, but it's important to see them operating in the Holy Spirit. And as I say, sometimes two or even three may be in operation together. And what is important is that they operate, and they operate through faith. And in our increasingly secular society, the church has never before needed the power of miracles which these gifts provide. So the first one I'm going to do, slightly out of order, is the workings of miracles. And the word in Greek, energemata, dunamion, is literally workings or energizings of powers. And it means working in the realm of nature beyond the normal laws of nature. We often say that we hear a beautiful piece of music. Wow, that's a miracle. You know, hear Mozart's music, I sometimes think, gosh, that's absolutely miraculous. Or see a beautiful flower when it comes out. Wow, that flower is a miracle of nature. But these things, of course, are things which happen in the normal course of nature, by the normal rules laid down by our wonderful Creator God. But a miracle, as we are talking about here, is something that takes place supernaturally over and above the normal laws of nature, like when Jesus turned the water into wine, or he fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. That is a miracle which happens over and above the normal laws of nature. Now, the humanist David Hume, in a past century, set the pattern for our age when he said we couldn't believe in miracles in a scientific age because they contradicted the laws of nature. And of course, that's just a worldview which says that scientific laws override all laws, and that God, having made natural laws, is bound by them. And people like David Hume, like many people do today, they live in a world of humanism, or what's called sometimes deism or Epicureanism, where God, if he exists, is something like an absentee landlord who's moved off to millions of miles away and has left mankind to his own affairs. So God never intervenes in the affairs of mankind, and that's one reason why at the time the theory of evolution got such a hold, and why it's got such a hold today. God, secularists believe, has left the universe to run, and the laws of science cannot be broken by things like miracles. But you see, we might see an example that C.S. Lewis gives. Imagine I'm staying in a hotel room and I want to save up money to pay my bill at the end, and there's a drawer there which has a lock on it, and on day one I put £100 in the drawer of that hotel room, and I lock it so I can have money to pay my bill with. Day two I put another £100 in the drawer. Well, I've got £200 by the laws of mathematics. Day three I put another £100 in. I've got £300 in. But if day 4 I look and I've only got £100 there, well, I look and I say, well, have the laws of mathematics been broken? No, the laws of mathematics haven't been broken, but probably the law of the land has been broken because somebody has got a key and opened the drawer and taken out some money. In other words, some other agency has been operating. And similarly, miracles are not contradictions of the laws of science or of nature, but assign another agency, this time a higher agency. The Spirit of God has been at work. You see, the world view of the Hebrews, of the Jews of the 1st century, was of a heaven and earth that interacted and interlocked, and of a God who was very near to his people. Look at what King David says in Psalm 145, verses 4 to 5. He said, "Let each generation tell its children of your mighty acts. Let them proclaim your power. I will meditate on your majestic, glorious splendor and your wonderful miracles." In other words, there is a completely different view of God, a God of vital nearness, a God who could do miracles. And Jesus taught that God is a Father who cares about the sparrows and numbers the hairs on our head. And because God has given us the Holy Spirit, of course he can vitally intervene wherever his people are and wherever they call upon his name in faith. Now, God is not bound, of course, by the laws of science he has created, any more than an author is bound by what he has written. And he can insert a comma anywhere he likes, as it is his manuscript. And a belief in miracles or not doesn't come down to a belief whether we believe in science or not. It comes down to our worldview as to whether we believe in God as an absentee landlord or whether we believe in God of the New Testament as Jesus and the apostles preached. Of course, miracles can happen just by normal answered prayer. But here we are talking about supernatural manifestations which alter the course of nature, the gift of working of miracles in nature. In other words, we're talking about miracles as Jesus did them. For example, when we already mentioned it, he turned the water into wine. That is something which is a miracle of nature. It cannot happen outside of a miracle. And neither can it happen when he fed 5,000 people. That's why people believed in him. Why? Well, they realized, of course, it couldn't happen any other way. It was a miracle. Similarly, when a friend had been dead 3 days, he raised him from the dead. Sorry, he'd been dead 4 days, I believe. He raised Lazarus from the dead. And this is an example of the working of miracles. Now, we can also be allowed to see special miracles in Acts chapter 19, as when Paul was wiping the sweat off his brow when he was praying for the sick. And it seems as though people took them and just put them on other people who were sick. And that brought healing to them. And it says God did extraordinary miracles by the hand of Paul. So miracles, this gift of working of miracles, is all part of the New Testament. We see prison doors being flung open by the gift of working of miracles. Now, A few more modern examples. I heard a missionary testifying of a farmer who was also a pastor in Africa had dedicated his harvest to the Lord to build a new church. And as he, just before his harvest, there was a tropical hailstorm. And he saw this hailstorm, as you do in Africa, coming over the fields towards his field. And it was smashing down everything before it. And he stood in his field and he cried out to the Lord to spare his field. And he saw the hail part and go round his field. And his field was spared. And of course, because of the hailstorm, prices went up and he had more than enough to build his church with. Another part of Africa, a witch doctor was plotting against an evangelist, a native evangelist, and the witch doctor said to the evangelist, "We have got some hairs on your mattress and we have put a curse on you, and tomorrow morning you will be dead." And that morning the whole village got up to see what was happening, whether the evangelist would indeed have dropped dead in the night. But as the evangelist got up to beat the drum for the morning prayer, there was a scream from the witch doctor, and it was the witch doctor who fell down dead by the gift of working of miracles. A friend of mine who I met in Burundi was in a car which was going down a mountainside, and there was a young soldier in the back, and the taxi driver was driving him down, and suddenly he lost the brakes. And the car was heading straight towards a cliff, a rock face, and it was heading at great speed, and there was no way it was going to stop. And the missionary thought this was it, he was going to meet his end, and he prayed to God to help them. And suddenly, without anything, the car stopped. And there was no way the car would stop. The brakes were gone, and the car suddenly stopped before this rock face. And the young soldier got out the car and danced round the car singing, "There is a God, there is a God, there is a God." How did the car stop? Well, the gift of working of miracles. Whether an angel got in the way, I don't know, but the car stopped miraculously. Now, we do know of cases where God has multiplied food to people. A friend of mine had needy people come to her house, and there was no way she had food to go round. But as she mixed the food up, she was going to make some cakes with this dough for people. There was no way she had enough for all the people that were there. But as she prayed over this, somehow everybody was fed by this, and she said there was no way we had enough to go round. But somehow the food went round by the gift of working of miracles. And there are sometimes creative miracles of healing. Stephen Jeffries, the evangelist, many years ago when he was at Bishop Auckland, there was a young girl who had no eyes. She had been born blind with no eyes in her head. And as Jeffries prayed for her, 2 new eyes grew in her head. And you can imagine what a stir that caused. And there were mounted police outside, apparently trying to control the crowds who were trying to get into this campaign after that. And I knew an old couple who were many years ago had been missionaries in the Congo, and Fred and Isabel, and they told me that one day Isabel, when they were much younger, and they were missionaries, Isabel had got meningitis, and in the remote part of the Congo there was very little medical help, and she had died. And the doctor said to Fred, he said, "Fred, make the coffin. We'd better bury her before the body starts decomposing." And Fred said, "I will not accept that." He said, "I went by the river and I cried to God." And he said, as I prayed, he said, a light came over the river and went into the house. And the nurse came running out. And she said, "Fred, the Lord has just stood at Isabel's bed and said, 'Isabel, live.'" And there standing in front of me was Isabel, still alive at the age of over 80. So what brought her back from the dead? The gift of working in miracles. So what is the trigger for the gift of working in miracles? Of course, the trigger is faith. Jesus says, Luke 17 verse 6, "If you have faith, even as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'May you be uprooted and be planted in the sea,' and it will obey you." Of course, that is a parable, but just a very, very small amount of faith of the right sort is very powerful, and it triggers the miraculous. I often think of Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, and you don't need much mass to convert to energy in a nuclear explosion to form an enormous amount of energy. And similarly, you do not need much of the right sort of faith to work a miracle. And we will be talking about faith next time.